All right, so procurement is acquisition of supplies and materials for your project. As we kind of mentioned yesterday, it involves communicating with other vendors, suppliers, issuing requests for information or proposals. As you can see on the screen, this knowledge area also spans 3 process groups: the planning, the executing, and the monitoring. Planning, again, similar to other areas, you're going to set the standards for your procurement. What are the things we need 2 levels of approval for? What are the things we need 3 levels of approval? What are the things we can procure and things we cannot? Are there certain financial limits on certain supplies? Things like that. It's basically your standards for procuring items on your project. When it comes to executing, it's actually doing that procurement work. So meeting with vendors, reviewing documents, putting specs out there, having interviews, looking at demos, all of those kinds of activities. And then you control your procurement by reviewing your actual work that you've been doing against your plan. Are you within the constraints and the guidelines that your team has put together for themselves? So we'll take a quick look at some of these areas really fast here. This comes from the PIM book, which is, again, the Project Management Body of Knowledge. It's the ANSI standard for project management, and I'll go through that book with you guys real quick towards the end of the day just to show you what it looks like. But it's a screenshot from one of their pages, and these are the 3 activities or processes, rather, that occur. And each one, as you can tell, has inputs, outputs, and some things that we do. Very similar to risk, it's based a lot on expert judgment, collecting data and gathering information, analyzing it, having meetings with your team and other vendors, going to places like trade shows so that you can be up to date with information about technologies and changes and things of that nature. When it comes to conducting the procurement, like we said earlier, it would involve some judgment on the feedback or the information that these vendors are providing you, discussing it with your team, vendor A versus vendor B, pros and cons, those types of things. You might send out a few email campaigns to let people know that you're having an RFP, a request for a proposal, so that they can submit it. You have bidding conferences, calls where they present their results or their responses, and you can discuss it with their team. All right, so it's sometimes this whole area is outsourced to your procurement department or your finance department, and sometimes it's the project team that works on it. It depends on, again, the culture of the organization. Typically, the project team will be the experienced people about the technical details of the procurement, and the procurement office or finance office will just be supporting. A lot of also legal work happens in this area. You have contracts, agreements, memos of understanding, these types of documents. Usually your legal team would review it before you send it out.
Excuse me about the NASA. So, okay, so inputs. Okay, what exactly does inputs and outputs mean in this case?
So any process has an input and an output, right? All the processes we've been talking about since Saturday, they all have inputs and outputs. So in this case, if I want to put a procurement plan together, right, that decides the standards for our procurement, one input you're going to reference is your project charter, because it explains what the project is all about. Another input could be number 5, enterprise environmental factors, like things that affect the organization, your cash flow. Organizational process assets, number 6, which are your policies and procedures, basically. So that's what we mean by inputs.
Yeah, inputs are basically the stuff that they're obviously the stuff that goes first, that goes into this. Outputs are like what happens after. Are they like the deliverables, like the end results?
The outputs are results. They're not necessarily deliverables. So they could be project artifacts. For example, your customer is not going to care too much about your source selection criteria, number 5, for example. They're going to care more about the solution itself, right? But how do you get there? They don't really care. So most of these outputs are going to be project artifacts internal to your project team. not necessarily deliverables. Okay, so remember there's a differentiation between a deliverable is something that the customer wants and will be using versus an output that you produce to get there, which is usually a project document like a WBS, a risk, a matrix, all these kinds of tools we've been talking about. Your customer really doesn't care about them. They know that they're important because it's going to help you get the deliverable realized, but at the end of the day, it's not going to run their business for them. Good question. Any other questions on procurement? All right. So let's go back to our project. What you guys want to do here is spend some time defining how you're going to communicate with your team, identifying things that you might need to purchase for procurement, and what these things are. You want to include that in your WBS. So if you have any steps related to purchasing supplies or material or hiring people, because we talked about resources as well, and communications, you want to include that in your WBS. So you're going to start brainstorming together some of these points, and then you go to your WBS here and start to add more details. You know, this should start to have a long list of things, 40, 50 items here. A real plan, right? A real job fair. And this is an online job fair. It's not because of COVID. This is an online job fair, not one in person. So make sure that you stick to that scope of work. Now, you guys defined some risks. You took some of those and hypothetically turned them into issues. When you come to mitigate these risks, think of those issues and what can you do to prevent them from happening in the first place. And those action items, those steps would go into your WBS as well. So you can have a section here, you can call it risk mitigation, and you put your risks, and under each risk, a subgroup of tasks and activities assigned to people with a budget, a start and date, so that you make sure you don't have those risks occurring. Okay, so right now you're going to spend more time in your WBS tab adding to it a lot of stuff related to what we talked about. And then when you guys are all done with that, the last thing we have here, or the next thing, is to talk about stakeholder management. We'll discuss who is a stakeholder on a project, and then we'll jump into a little blurb on leadership and agile project management. So really you should be beefing up your WBS right now. Think of it again as a real project plan that you're going to give someone to implement once you're done. All right. Any questions before we disperse into our groups? Everyone clear what we're doing? All right. I will see you in the rooms.